Okay. Hi, Timothy. Can you hear us? Can we see you? Just before we are going to start in about a minute or two. Otherwise, we just try to adjust. Hi, Timothy. Just checking again. I think we're gonna just have to see if we can start. In the interest of time, we have a very engaging discussion, and so I think it would be good for us to just go ahead. And if you could just give me a moment, I don't know if you can see me, and there we go. Naima, Jean-Pierre, Ekaterina. Hope all is good on your side. Sorry about this. Timothy, whenever you have the chance, just let us know. But I think because of the connection, somehow he's not able to hear us. So we will maintain it as it is and come back in a bit. But I think maybe just to do a bit of a setting for those colleagues who were sitting with us in the People's Migration Challenge and the connection. I mean, there we were talking about climate change and migration. And please feel free to check on GRFDT website in terms of, understanding the different dimensions that were covered. I think we would not do justice to that conversation here. And the idea for this afternoon today, transitioning over to the GCM objectives, usually we do have, this space where we try to show the interconnection between them. But I think for this afternoon, we will just go straight ahead into our webinar in the interest of time. And today we are really delighted that we have taken this journey along. Last week we were looking at counter-smuggling.
YouTube.
Okay, are we good to go, Dr. Sahu? All right, today is our day for technical glitches, but we must persevere. We must persevere and go on.
Some noise, Perry. I think
sorry?
some YouTube will be running.
Dr. Sahu, may I suggest that you stop the recording and start it again, because otherwise we have an issue. We're interrupted with some background noise, and maybe we just need to move wherever that noise is from. So if we could just start again, just to set ourselves at ease and to be a bit more relaxed. Okay. Dr. Sada? All right, let's sail along. It's GCM webinar on eradicating trafficking. Like I was saying, I think we have crossed quite a number of topical issues, and we have touched on aspects of prevention, combating and eradicating trafficking in the other 9 objectives that we touched on, particularly when we looked at smuggling, counter smuggling last week, where we actually asked ourselves the question, what is the main difference? But as always, we do justice to these conversations around the Global Compact for Migration under the certificate program that covers the Global Compact for Migration. And the idea is for us to unpack each and every one of them. Apologies for that. I think we're just trying to sort out some technical issues on our background. So we will go a little bit back and forth, and also because some of the students would be re-listening to these conversations. So it's kind of important for us to have everything recorded. Dr. Sada, I will go ahead at your cue. I can see Feroz, are you in the background? Feroz, are you there?
Yes, but I am not a co-host.
Okay. And Dr. Sahu seems to have turned off the recording. Is there something we should be doing on our end?
From there.
Super. Thanks a lot. And maybe then in the meantime, because I think the recording is kind of important for us, I think what we could do is, okay, are we back? Not yet. Apologies, everyone. This is life with virtual, in the virtual world, so we have to make do. Right. Okay, I'm so sorry to sound like a broken record, but it's good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from. We are smiling because we've had a lot of technical glitches, so we hope this time we are actually going live, and it's the last time that I have to give an introduction. We are very delighted to be in this room, as we are every single Tuesday, where we unpack the Global Compact for Migration objectives, the 23 of them. And today we are zooming in on Global Compact for Migration objective number 10. That centers around eradicating trafficking. And this is in the context of international migration. So, as the organizers, so, the Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants, the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, the International Institute for Migration and Development, Metropolis Asia Pacific, as well as the Migrant Forum in Asia, we are really delighted to be collaborating for this particular webinar with our partner Freedom Collaborative. And we have put together not just an excellent panel, but also an excellent moderation. So we will be listening to our panel in a bit, but I thought that it's very important for us to set the context. I think as we have often touched on in our conversation on Global Compact, we do know that we're not working in silos, and we do know that there's quite some relation between the various compacts. We have touched on issues related to trafficking in the last couple of sessions, particularly when we looked at counter smuggling. Some of us left intrigued, some of us, I think, left confused from last week, and maybe we will have more light shed, or maybe we will go into a level of confusion, or maybe we will have bigger dreams. And like somebody said, if your dreams do not scare you, then you should be rechecking them again. So, and what are the dreams? I think that the Global Compact for Migration at least outlined in the form of objectives when the different countries came up together. The idea was for them to look at ways to prevent, combat, and eradicate trafficking in persons in the context of international migration. And for today's panel, it will be moderated, and I would like to just introduce the moderator, and she will run the show after this. We're really delighted to be joined by Naima Mungai, who is from the Africa Women Journalism Project. And she is first and foremost, that's very important to say, a creative, very passionate about filmmaking and journalism, and has been working around documentary filmmaking and visual storytelling. And she's the program manager for the Africa Women Journalism Project. And she has been, deeply involved and deeply cares about ethical story writing, data journalism, as well as improving improving the state of journalism in Africa, particularly focusing on building the capacity of African women journalists. Very passionate about journalism, but also very passionate about the subject that we're going to touch on, also due to other experiences that she has had engaging in communities, as well as highlighting the voices of marginalized and underreported communities. Naima, I will leave the show over to you for you to continue from here. Thank you so much for taking this on for us. Naima, over to you.
I'm going to have to say thank you to you because you've basically given me like every journalist's like dream. I can interview all these people for everything. But yeah, that's neither here nor there. Thank you very much, Patty, for that amazing introduction. My name is Naima, as Patty has said, and luckily I'm not the only person talking on this thing. I am joined by 3 amazing people who are on this call and 1 person who cannot make it, but has gladly, I mean, Patty stepped in for me a little bit over there, and so we'll be able to watch a recording from her on her views on some of the things that we are talking about. So, if we look at Objective 10, which is around preventing, combating, and eradicating trafficking in persons in the context of international migration, this will actually look at what legislative or other measures are needed to prevent and combat and eradicate trafficking in persons in the context of international migration. And that was where this whole entire Objective 10 sort of came from in the entire GCM. And because I can't talk about this on my own, I'm going to introduce my panel of amazing people. And first, I'm going to introduce Dr. Jean-Pierre Gauchi, who is a senior research fellow at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. I'm going to give him 30 seconds to say hi and wave at all of you and add anything that he thinks you should know about him.
Hi, everyone. Very nice to be here. And thank you very much, Naima, for the introduction and Paddy for the invitation. I am delighted to be here. I work on trafficking, migration, and asylum issues, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation.
I can see someone just raise their hand. I don't know if you want to text and to type and see and to sort of see what questions you might have in the chat. And next, I am so happy. I was really amazed to meet this next person because just lost myself going through the kind of work that they've been doing. I'm very, very, impressed. And this is Ekaterina Porras, and she's the founder and director of Do Gold. Do Bold. Sorry, not Do Gold. Do Bold. Do Bold. It's gold. Ekaterina, I've given you a new about you. And Do Bold works with migrant workers in Gulf countries and focusing on issues of human trafficking and modern day slavery. And oh my God, they have won so many awards, and they have been finalists at the Nelson Mandela Prize. They're chosen as one of the 100 Sparks of Hope. So amazing work from them. Ekaterina, maybe you can say something and wave at everyone.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Naima, for this introduction. And no more to say. I really want to hear from everyone as well. And yes, we are Do Bold, but we also try to do good. I think that's where you were confusing the name. But yeah.
Do Bold.
Perfect.
Do Bold, Do Gold.
Do good. Yeah, but our name is Do Bold.
Yes, that's really beautiful. Sorry, English, as we say in Kenya, in Kiswahili we say Kiingereza ilikuja na meli. English came, with a ship. So sometimes we forget a bit about it. And on that note, from Kenya, I want to introduce Timothy Akombo, who is also Kenyan. Yay, Team Kenya. He is an anti-trafficking activist, a human rights champion, and an enthusiastic community organizer. He is a research associate with the Counter Human Trafficking Trust East African, CHTER. And I can say I have worked with CHTER before on stories, and they do amazing work. So Timothy, say a few
Yes.
words. Tell everybody habari.
Hey, good evening, people, good people. Hi, everyone.
Yes, good evening. On behalf of everyone, good evening.
Yeah, sorry, I had technical issues, but I've been able to join you. It's a privilege to be here. I'm not so sure if you guys have gone so far.
We've just started.
Oh, wonderful. Good to see you.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's okay.
And I will introduce someone who is not in the room. You will get to hear from her very soon. Her name is Hannah Tiane, and she's the senior product manager at DGNex. And she leads research on migrant tech research, and has led a multidisciplinary team innovating and inventing ICT tools to support proactive and consistent screening of workers in situations of labor exploitation and trafficking. I cannot wait to hear what we're going to talk about. So I know that everybody's here to learn, and I think that we are also here to learn as panelists. So I hope you guys ask your questions, and if we realize there's a lot of them, we will stop and answer them at that particular point. And then the other thing that I want to sit down and say is, I had 2 questions today. So you cannot answer your own questions. So Ekaterina, Paddy, I'm going to drag you into this. Ekaterina and Jean-Paul and Timothy, I want you to let me know who said that what they wanted to learn from this project, from this seminar, is whether there is a gap, right? With the participants who are in this webinar in how they perceive if there's a difference between the theoretical and the practical areas of human trafficking. That's what she wants to learn. Do the participants see a difference in the theoretical and practical area of human trafficking? Who wants to answer that? Jean-Paul, Timothy, who do you think that was? Paddy?
I'm gonna say Paddy actually for that one.
Okay, we have Paddy. Participants can answer the questions as well in the chat. Who do you think it is? Who do you think it is?
Maybe yourself.
Oh no, that was Ekaterina. That was Ekaterina. That was Ekaterina.
Wow.
And we'll ask the next question later on when I see, you guys are almost asleep. So we're going to start our conversation. And one of the things that I, as a journalist, have had questions about around human trafficking is that it seems like such a big thing. It seems like such a huge problem. It seems like something that is never ending. And I want to know from all of you, from your different perspectives in the work that you do, where are we with the efforts to prevent, fight, and eradicate human trafficking ever since the GCM was adopted? And that's the first part of the question. So let's answer that question.
I'm happy to go first. So I think the question is where are we since the GCM was adopted? But I think it's also good to think about where were we when the GCM was adopted, which is in the context of human trafficking, we'd achieved quite a bit in the last 20 years, the last 22 years, specifically since the adoption of the Anti-Trafficking Protocol, which was adopted in the early 2000s. I'm a lawyer by training, so I will unfortunately be focused quite a lot on the legal frameworks. But I do think that the protocol is important. It's important for a number of reasons. The main one being that it, for once, gives us a definition of trafficking that the international community could sort of agree on. And I do say sort of intentionally. It's not a kind of complete agreement by any measure. It is clearly a compromise. Like most of international law, the trafficking protocol is clearly a compromise, but I think it is a key development that the having that one definition is a key development. And it's a key development for a number of reasons. The main one being that one of the key things if we want to eradicate trafficking, like the GCM asks us to, is cooperation between states. And it's very difficult to cooperate if you do not have an underlying or a shared understanding of what the issue is. Now, the definition gives us a bit of that understanding. It doesn't give us 100% convergence of what we mean by trafficking. And I think there's a lot more work that's been done since the protocol and that's still being done to come to a bit more of that convergence. But I think it gives us a solid basis for that cooperation. The other thing is we've also seen developments at the regional level. So we've seen the Council of Europe adopt its own convention on trafficking. We've seen ASEAN adopt its own convention on trafficking. We've seen other instruments being adopted in different regions around the world and at the sub-regional level as well, which I think is clearly important. They also reflect what is in the protocol, the definition, the protocol, etc., and take it a step further. The other thing that I think the GCM does is it doesn't necessarily create it's not rocket science when it comes to anti-trafficking. In the most part, it's basically asking us to actually do what we've promised to do. And by us, I mean states primarily, but also other actors, whether that's the humanitarian sector, whether that's the development sector, whether that's the anti-trafficking sector, whether that's the migrant rights sector. I think one thing that happened in the last 20 years, but was kind of consolidated quite a bit with the GCM, is bringing the conversations about trafficking and about migration closer to each other. I think when the protocol was discussed and adopted, it was seen very much as a labor issue potentially, but mainly as a women's rights issue. And in fact, part of the conversation was, who does the protocol focus on? And that is one of the things the protocol did, was it expanded the definition of trafficking as covering everyone, not just women and children. But I think since then, and I suspect this is the case in many countries, we've seen different movements working on trafficking, whether that's the women's rights movement, whether that's the labor rights movement, etc. And I think now more and more, especially over the last 10, 15 years, we're seeing the migration movement come more kind of actively into the anti-trafficking work. And I think that is only a very good thing. And the GCM does allow us to actually think about trafficking in the context of that. The other thing that's happened is more and more actors are involved in anti-trafficking nowadays. And that's, again, only a very good thing. We're seeing people, organizations, individuals coming from all sorts of backgrounds and now engaging with anti-trafficking. And we're seeing more and more actors trying to push states to do more, trying to push states to do better, trying to hold states to account for not doing what they've promised to do, and trying to help us understand better what those obligations are, whether that's the emphasis in the last couple of years on the non-punishment principle as a way of protecting trafficked persons, or whether that's the excellent work being done by UNODC and others on the interpretation of the definition of trafficking and particular elements, the work that's just been published on the word exploitation and kind of what that means, what does that entail? How does trafficking link to labor exploitation? How does it link to other forms of exploitation that might not be trafficking? How do we make sure that we're not putting the label of trafficking on absolutely everything and therefore losing the meaning of it, whilst at the same time making sure that situations of trafficking are actually considered to be situations of trafficking, and more importantly, that trafficked persons are identified as such and therefore protected as trafficked persons. I'll stop talking now.
I think you were the
perhaps-
perfect person to answer this question. And we'll come back to it in terms of when we're discussing definitions and things. There's a very interesting question on that. And I'm going to add a second part to this question, and I'm throwing this to Ekaterina and Timothy. And my question is, given all of that, given the fact that we started off, with suddenly we have this thing that tells us what trafficking is or isn't, and what these different terms are, as Jean-Pierre has said. But what has been the effect of COVID-19, this unprecedented global health issue? What has been that effect on human trafficking? In the context of the work that you're doing, Ekaterina, for you in the Gulf states, and Timothy, with the research that you're doing on the continent, what have you experienced? Has it made things worse? Has it made things better? If I could start with you, Timothy, or Ekaterina. Ekaterina, you can go ahead.
Okay.
Timothy.
Yeah.
I go ahead.
All right, Timothy. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for this privilege. First, I would like to say that COVID has presented new challenges and new opportunities at the same time. We've seen, for example, the intensification of the use of technology in terms of recruiters. Traffickers have really gone way too ahead of us in terms of their recruitment, and it has also presented an opportunity like this one, for example, in such a way that we are able to have conversations around human trafficking and how we can alleviate it. The other issue is COVID-19 has, human trafficking is a business that goes underground, that happens. It doesn't happen in plain sight, so it has further pushed things down further. In such a way that if we look at the Global Compact for Migration, for instance, it has made migration really follow dangerous routes. People are following really precarious routes, and they're engaging in really ways such that, because you remember there's been lockdown, you remember that there's been restrictions on how to go into other countries, and these are the multiple other issues surrounding ways to curb COVID-19. And you remember also people have lost jobs. Some children are not going to school. So I'll give a perspective of Kenya, where I am actually, because during this time, and Kenyans will attest to this, we really experienced a lot of gender-based violence at homes. We experienced cases of rape more than any other time before. And I think it was due to the availability of, let's say, children at home for abuse. Let's say the stress that people were undergoing, so they found ways of channeling them out. And so in this way, it really made things even more worse. And I will tell you, the grip that the traffickers had on the victims of trafficking was even more serious, I would say, because now it's private. You're not allowed. Let me talk of domestic workers, for example. Those guys were going through trouble, I will tell you, because now you're not allowed to go into visiting people's houses and stuff like that. And they're also not allowed to move out because they're said to, they'll come with COVID when they come from, let's say, the supermarket or something like that. And so, but COVID has also taught us new ways of doing things. And I think technologies is my huge takeaway, because we really have to adapt during this time. We have no chance but to, we have no laxity or to relax and say that now COVID has happened and we can't do anything. But we can really use technology and assist in alleviating this pandemic and fighting human trafficking as well. But COVID has been, it has exacerbated the problem actually. Thank you.
That was very interesting, Timothy, and I'm amazed that you brought up technology, because we will talk about that a little bit further. I've just put in the chat, for the participants, you can share any questions or any views that you have on the questions, on the topics that we're discussing, and the questions that the panelists are answering, so that it's a little bit more, we don't sound like talking heads. Ekaterina, how has COVID-19 affected the work that you're doing?
Yes, well, for us, I think it has affected us in two ways. One, of course, is how it has affected the migrant workers, and especially those that are more vulnerable, and us as an organization, and how are we going to respond, especially in countries where civic space is either restricted or closed. What does that mean is very important to understand. Now, I'm going to go really to the ground so everyone can understand really what happened when COVID-19 hit the Gulf countries. And I will just highlight on few issues. Well, first of all, we had to adapt to the needs of the migrant workers. And what happened first is that we saw mass redundancies from work. Many workers were let go without any payments, including past salaries and their end of service benefits. What did that mean? Many people, because of immigration as well, need to go home within a certain amount of time. But flights were down. Food was a big need on the ground, and that's how we first mobilized to get food to the people. But then we realized more rooted issues, and I think this is very clear for us to know that human trafficking and all the issues that come with it, such as forced labor or debtness, has always been there. It is just that COVID-19 has really dismantled into the open actually what is happening behind closed doors. For domestic workers has been it has affected them especially because they are working inside the homes, plus having families working from home. That meant their work was increased in hours. So before, from 14 to 16 hours normal working hours that they had, it increased all the way up to 18 hours a day without any day off. This has led to extreme exhaustion. Workers especially having to flee their employers, and then other issues come just from the certain elements of the kafala system, such as absconding charges. So COVID-19, I think the takeaway is that it has affected all of us, but it is very clear that those that are more vulnerable, such as victims of human trafficking, have been more affected clearly.
And just to add just a level to that question, in terms of the migrant workers that you're working with, are we talking about is it more women or more men, especially for domestic workers? Has there been a difference in how they've been treated? Because you've got like domestic workers and you've got people working in construction, for instance, in the Gulf states.
During the pandemic, we have supported three particular groups of migrant workers. One is domestic workers, which is the largest number, and they're all women. we've had maybe 3 or 4 men, but we're talking about hundreds of women. The second group that we have supported during COVID are working in the service industries. And they are, I would say 50%, 50%, very equal, many nationalities as well. It has affected them differently according to nationalities, especially because before coming to the Gulf region, how they came, it is different. So Sri Lankans, for Sri Lankans to come to the Gulf is going to be different than for a Filipino. And the third group that we have supported are single mothers that have given birth whose children are not receiving a birth certificate, and as thus are more prone to trafficking. And this is the third group. And of course, they're all women, but it also includes their children.
Okay, and I think, Jean-Pierre, I'm going to let you jump in with a little bit of something there to add on to what Ekaterina said.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what both Timothy and Ekaterina said really resonate with some of the work we've been doing on these issues and trying to understand the impact of COVID. But I'll take it kind of one step away from the kind of grassroots kind of day-to-day service provision. And I think there's been 2 impacts of COVID on anti-trafficking efforts generally. And the first one is that states in some ways realize that there are these vulnerable communities within their borders and that they should protect more in some countries, obviously not all by any measure. And I think that's been positive. And I think we've seen some cases where, for example, certain visa restrictions were waived because of COVID to allow people to stay longer, etc. So that's a positive. The key negative, I think that we've noticed is there's been a shift in donor priorities and in funding priorities. And everything is now wanting to fund things to do with COVID. But obviously, COVID is not the only problem that's out there. And all the other priorities, including anti-trafficking that were priorities before, are now in many contexts being sidestepped because all the attention is put on COVID, because that's kind of the new thing and the main thing that everyone wants to think about these days. So I think those are kind of 2 sides of the impact of COVID. The other one that I think we've noticed as well is there's been less follow-up on what states are doing or what they've promised to do, because the international system is not particularly well geared for dealing with a global pandemic, and therefore kind of some of the follow-up mechanisms were frozen. So whether that's monitoring bodies by treaty bodies, etc., that were not following up on what states had promised to do in the anti-trafficking context. So obviously there's the day-to-day sort of work that Ekaterina and Timothy are talking about, which is what's most felt on the ground. But if you take it to one step above in the kind of impact on policies, I think donor priorities and funding priorities, as well as kind of just general policy priorities and the shift away from anti-trafficking in that context, have been 2 of the key impacts in the last 2 years.
Yes, and I think that's really amazing to sort of think about, and it is also amazing that in one way the pandemic has meant that more people can actually see, it's more visual, that trafficking, like they're these vulnerable groups, it's more visual, it was put in front of the public eye a lot more. But in the same way, it was difficult to now hold governments to sit down and say them, so what are you doing, and how are you changing this? Now you actually raised something, so I want to start. I'm trying to think about between you and Ekaterina. I think I'll start with Ekaterina. Ekaterina, yes, say something.
No, go ahead and ask, and then I will just add.
Okay, so my next question, because you all discussed with me, sorry, I have one of my puppies driving me crazy in the background over here, but one of the questions, one of the things that you both mentioned, and also Timothy, is around terminology and being able to sit down and define these things and how the GCM has helped with that. But for me, as a journalist, I think one of the problems that I find when I'm working with journalists on stories around human trafficking and with CSOs is that one of the barriers, in my own opinion, in the work that I've done, is a lack of understanding of the concepts and terms around human trafficking. So, Katerina, I'm going to start with trafficked persons. How does this idea of sort of the terms that are used, how do they refer to themselves? How do other people refer to themselves? And how does that affect their ability to seek for help, to be helped, or to be integrated into society, or even get support from the governments in the countries that they have been trafficked to?
Yes, I'll just quickly say regarding COVID-19 very quickly is that we are still struggling with COVID-19 and the effects that it's having on migrant workers. Just not to forget that this has not passed and the issues are still well present. Just for us to remember, even if we seem to be in the normal, it still hasn't changed for many. Regarding terminology, yes, this is a very interesting concept, and it's so important on how the awareness around it and how it is talked about, especially among the community, among those that are trafficked, because something that we have noticed is that most of the victims of human trafficking that we have worked with has seemed very normal to pay to come to a program, to work in a restaurant or whatever it was promised. So it is very common to pay because it is seen as a service. So and they named this a program, and just of having this concept of a program, I am joining a program to go to the Gulf and work in a restaurant. It seems it becomes normalized to pay a trafficker or a recruiter to give you that opportunity. And that we have seen quite often, unfortunately. Now, for the community themselves, for example, when we talk to them, of course, we are not able to ask, are you a victim of trafficking? Because it is a very little understood term, and even in the even in the higher context of policymakers and how are we going to identify human traffickers. So imagine at a community level. So it is very important to name things and understand, at least for us, because we are on the ground, how is a community referring to different terminology that we know it is human trafficking or forced labor. I'm working a reliever, for example. A worker will say, I'm working a reliever. What is a reliever? It doesn't sound bad, does it? Well, it is an extra day that actually you have to work. So it can be considered forced labor. So we really need to understand what this terminology is being used on the ground, and how can we identify victims of human trafficking and what terminology they're using to understand how we should respond. So these are two examples of terminology being used.
So just a quick follow-up question on that. So you've just said that based on those terms, at what point do they realize that they have been trafficked? At what point, what is it that leads them to sit down and say, this is not Right. And when do they accept that particular label of that they have been trafficked or that they're a victim of trafficking?
Unfortunately, what we have seen is that a lot of the population actually doesn't realize that they have been trafficked. Despite now, I think it's very clear to point out that we are not working on the reintegration part. We are working on in the sending countries. So we have seen many workers that are not understanding or not seeing it as bad as it is that they are victims of trafficking. Even the fact of giving a payment for recruiting to the Gulf with a false promises, despite that one of our jobs is to really make sure that everybody knows what are their rights, what is right and what is wrong. That is a minimum that we need to accomplish. And what we have seen is that we have repatriated workers last year. They have come back. We have seen a number of workers already back in the Gulf that has gone through the same process of recruitment. Despite that, even before paying for the recruiter, we reiterated and said, please, this is illegal. You're not supposed to do this. As much as information as possible, and it leads to other questions. Why?
Okay.
So in short, many communities actually do not know that have been trafficked.
So just to Timothy, if you can now take up from that. So based on what Ekaterina has said, on your research and in the work that you've been doing, how does the understanding of these terms affect efforts and initiatives of people working in the counter trafficking spaces?
That's a very interesting discussion, by the way, because it's really easy to get confused and based on terminologies when tackling human trafficking, and that's an impediment in the war against trafficking, I will say. We've seen victims of trafficking being treated as illegal migrants, for example, and the police force really assume that these are not victims of trafficking, while in the real sense they are. And that also points to the issue of the confusion that is seen between defining human trafficking and smuggling at the same time. So you find that there's a time I was creating awareness somewhere, and I really argued with one participant, telling them that human trafficking is not synonymous to smuggling, because even the TIP report from the Department of State says that it's not a requirement for someone to be physically transported from one location to another for the crime to fall under human trafficking. And another issue is also that, do we refer to the victims as, at what point does someone refer to let's say that this is a survivor and this is a victim, for example? You see, it's quite challenging. And again, you find that people tend to believe that slavery is also equivalent to human trafficking. Well, slavery was something that was legally accepted in history. But human trafficking, you see, it's something that is illegal. It's not accepted. So maybe Jean can really assist in highlighting some of that. And another thing also that I find really contentious about human trafficking is consent. Really, if you've been deceived, if you've been duped into something and you accept, is that, can I be say that I consented, yet I was lied to at the first from the word go. So I really think, for me, I've in my research I found out that maybe someone could add meat into this, but I find that consent is not even a requirement for someone to be said that they're victims, because they were lied to, they were duped. And if they actually knew that this is what they were going to get into, they would not have accepted or went that way. So I think basically those are the issues that are really bringing confusion in the fight against human trafficking. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and as we sort of talk about definitions, the very interesting around consent, I'd like to hear, very interested to hear what people have to say about that. I would like to give it forward to Paddy to sit down and play the video from Hannah. You on talking about how technology is used in leveraging joint efforts, and then maybe we can have a quick conversation around that before we open the field up for questions. Paddy?
Okay, Feroz, the volume, just the volume. We still can't hear. Feroz?
Yes, sir is working on it. Just give me a second.
Okay. Researcher at the United Nations University Institute and a senior product manager at the. All right. We are here today touching on a global compact for migration objective that is looking at eradicating trafficking. And I am really pleased that we're able to have this session with Hannah Tignane. I hope I have pronounced it correctly. Hannah, who is a consulting researcher at the United Nations University Institute and a senior product manager at DigiNext, which is based in Hong Kong. But she's currently sitting in Macau, and really she is a global citizen, born in Wales, connected to Australia, a marriage brought up to Lesotho, yay, Africa one day, and then speaking to us from Macau, but working for an institution that's based in Hong Kong. Hannah, we're really happy that you could find time to join us for this webinar and share your inputs from the point of view of ICT use in technology. And just to give a bit of more of introduction, Hannah has been working or with various teams and various projects on a multidisciplinary team that has been looking at, inventing ICT to support a proactive and consistent screening of workers in situations of labor exploitation and human trafficking. She'll tell us more about that. But she comes with a lot of experience from the academic side, but a lot of practical experience in the space of ICT. So I think that's always refreshing when we get people who have worked from the ICT side, bridging over to development, how work has really gone in areas in Africa and Southeast Asia, and making a lot of strong connections with mobile operators, local and national governments, international, intergovernmental organizations, as well as private sector and civil society organizations. So Hannah, we're happy that you could join us today. Thanks for having me. Quite a long introduction. Yes, I'm a mouthful, and I was going to go into the publications, but then I think what we will do is just share some of the linkages, some of the links of some of the work that you have done also with our students and our audience, so that they can really benefit from your very interesting work. Let's get into it. Hannah, we just wanted to hear more about, as you're sharing with us some of your work at DigiNext and at the UNU, and in particularly with the Appraise project, which you tell us more about. To what extent
can technology sort of be this enabler in efforts that are in efforts that are being made to eradicate human trafficking? And really, can technology be used for identifying potential victims of trafficking, and how does that work?
Cool, thanks for the question. So maybe I'll start by just telling you how I have used technology, and then I'll try and go back if I remember to say that it's not always the case. Technology is just a tool. So my work at UMU, I started in late 2016. I wanted to understand how ICTs can support victim identification. If you look at all of the numbers, you see any of the stats, like 25 million people in situations of forced labor and human trafficking. And then if you look at the number, less than 100,000 each year are identified and subsequently helped. So this told me that we don't know much about cases because there is such a small proportion that we know about. And our current tools for identifying people are flawed because we're missing a whole heap of them. So as a technologist, my background is in ICT for development. So as a technologist, I understood that I don't understand what the problem is, but I know people who will know. So we had a series of stakeholder consultations based in Thailand with NGOs as well as government, so police, the Department of Special Investigations Anti-Human Trafficking Centre, which is Ministry of Justice in Thailand, IOM and ILO, as well as survivors in shelters within the NGOs, just to understand how people currently identify victims, what problems they face, and how they believe technology could support them to overcome those problems. And now these were brainstormings that imagine people came up with all these ideas, including like we need to have these mass surveillance networks to see what everybody's doing. I wasn't really interested in that. But one thing they did mention is that in initial screening, so in the field when you're trying to identify people, it's in front of a lot of people, potentially the exploiter. And everyone speaks different languages, and often your frontline responders, your NGO, the police officer, the labour inspector, your auditor, they don't know what the current practices of exploitation are. So all of these things together mean it's very difficult to find someone who needs extra help. So together we had the idea that we could develop a tool that supports this initial screening so that you could ask questions and workers would feel safe to respond in a language that they understand. So based on this, I developed a system called a prize. And a prize allows us really to make these lists of questions, and the questions are yes, no, worded, and they're about those common indicators of exploitation. So if we think about it, in sex work, I would exploit someone different to on a fishing vessel. So we need this to be sector specific. And if we have our questions as yes, no, worded, can translate them easily and audio record them. So if you don't, if you're not able to read, then you can still listen if I give you headphones. And then based on all of this, we can analyze your responses and calculate the vulnerability of your situation. So that's really what the tool I developed does. So a prize has been used in fishing in Thailand, in sex work as well in Thailand. It's been trialled by police officers in their outreach and also by NGOs in outreach. But the group that have used it the most are auditors and supply chains. I was looking yesterday and there were 18,435 interviews that they had done using the tool to assess working conditions in supply chains of multinational corporations. And I said I would go back to my point. So technology, in this case, technology can be used to help with that initial screening so that somebody can understand the questions that they're asked and answer privately without anyone around them knowing what they're answering to. But it's just a tool. So if I was going to exploit you in an audit of a supply chain and cover up the exploitation that you're facing because I'm corrupt or whatever, I'll do the same thing with any technology. So there's always that thing in the back of our mind that we need to remember, that technology doesn't change my intentions. It just gives me another tool to continue doing what I was already going to do.
Thank you, Hannah, for that. And just thinking about, outlining to us sort of the users of this tool and what that has also meant in terms of identification, which is identification of potential victims of trafficking, which is really a very crucial part, I think, in terms of eradicating, is identifying, who needs to be, who has the potential to be trafficked, but also who is being trafficked in this way. And maybe we can just come and ask a question around COVID, because we do know that COVID is being called a disruptor in the world of work, but it's also and I wanted to get a sense from you. With COVID being looked at as a disruptor around the identification of victims of trafficking, do you see it in this way? Or there's also the other side, which is where COVID is being stated as showing this kind of evidence, right? That now we know, since we are sitting in lockdown, since we're sitting in our homes, we sort of see what the digital divide has actually been among populations, but also among different types of migrant groups, refugees and IDPs, for instance, so that people have had different access to technology. How would you say this kind of thinking around COVID as a disruptor, or sort of as a way of showing evidence in the space of digital divide, how do you think this kind of applies in this broader sense of eradicating trafficking?
Yeah, so I definitely see COVID-19 as a disruptor to the standard way that we have been living and operating for the past decades, I guess. If we look at victim identification, the work that we've done with the prize has always been looking at on-site inspections, so face-to-face interaction. And that's how I wanted to, I designed it that way, because if I find someone who's in a vulnerable situation and I'm a frontline responder, it's my job to help them, well, then I can help them if they ask me for help. If it's like not in person and they say I need help and I say, great, you need help, I can help you, but I can't find them, then it hasn't helped the situation. So what COVID-19 did for us is it forced us to rethink the way that we support frontline responders to do their outreach. Because now the frontline responder can't go out and they can't go to the docks or wherever it is they're looking for potential victims. So how can we support them in these times of movement restrictions? We also know that vulnerable workers will push into further vulnerability, because now they're the ones whose jobs get cut first, and they're the ones who now they still have bills, they still need to eat, so they're forced to look for more dangerous work as well. So what we actually did was we took it as a chance to pivot the way we were using technology, and I kind of pivoted a prize audit so that now people can do interviews online instead of only doing this in person. Part of me is like, I can't guarantee who is answering the questions. Maybe it's the exploiter who is answering on behalf of the worker. But actually, when I was talking to the frontline responders, they were saying, it's easy for you to say that in the comfort of your house, but what if this is the only way you could ask for help? Are you willing to give them the chance of someone answering, I'm safe, if it meant that it also gave someone the opportunity to seek help? And I thought, okay, you've got a point. It's easier always to be in, to always consider from your own perspective instead of this other perspective.
Absolutely interesting. I think in terms of this interface between technology and how would you say the good old ways, like somebody had said that sometimes we want to do away with that in the space of trying to come up with new and innovative ideas. But it's actually interesting to see that you still, there is value in frontliners actually being physically able to go into a space as compared to using an or technology or virtually based tool. But at the same time, very interesting to hear how we've adjusted to give the opportunity, at least if this was the only chance, that potential victims of trafficking could be able to get the support that they needed, which was very, in most cases, desperate. I think, given the circumstances. Let's just maybe move a little bit to the other spaces. So we've talked about identification, and we know how that is important. And I wanted to understand, in terms of the tool, appraise as a tool, another maybe complementary tools or mechanism, how does your work then feed into these spaces? So, we're talking about the space of trafficking, modern slavery, forced labor, and exploitation. And we're trying to get a sense of how it kind of feeds into the other tools. And, can it impact, in asking this question, we're wondering, can it impact or can it support movement on the other P's, as we sort of call them, on protection and prosecution? So, victims have been identified, and frontline responders go ahead with the necessary referral and the necessary assessments that they have to do that lead up to protection. How do you feel that enhances protection mechanisms and measures? How does that enhance in any space on the prosecution side in terms of perpetrators being brought to justice?
Yeah. So part that I didn't mention about a prize is that those yes or no worded questions, the responses to them, they when the responders next in Wi-Fi connectivity, the responses are uploaded to their organization account, so that their organization can see how are reported practices of exploitation changing over time. If we think of these 18,000 interviews that we've collected, that's a longitudinal study over a year, nearly 2 years, we've got that many. So you can analyze them and say, for example, for a question list, which is a sector, so a sector of work, and maybe a language of respondents, and a geographic location, and maybe gender as well. What are the current practices of exploitation that are reported? It's always important to remember that this is reported practices. They haven't been investigated at the time enterprise is working, but it's the reported practices. And so then we can see, if we look at time, how that changes over time. My idea with the P's is that with protection, we're looking at proactive screening of workers in vulnerable situations. So better trained frontline responders who are better able to detect and then respond to cases. So if we do that screening with a tool like a prize, then we can analyze the results and we can identify the current and changing patterns of exploitation. And then my big goal, if I could have a dream situation, would be that these practices could inform evidence-based prevention and prosecution. Because if I now know what the practices of exploitation are right now for people who speak this language, who come from this area, then I can maybe put in place policy to prevent workers from going into these situations. Or the information could also contribute to an evidence base for further prosecution, because now we have more information about what people are doing right now. So that's my big goal for the piece.
Hannah, thanks for that. I actually heard the other day that if your dream is not big enough, if your dream doesn't scare you, then it's probably not big enough. So
it's scary.
That's good. And I think that the work that you're doing here is critical and important. So we hope that you continue dreaming big in this area. And in saying this, I'm just thinking about how there's such an interconnection with some of the areas in the Global Compact for Migration on this, looking at spaces around addressing vulnerabilities, for instance, and what actually that would mean in terms of the information that would come out from this appraise tool that you are able to also, I guess, pick up data on what kind of vulnerabilities that migrants are facing and that potential victims of trafficking have also faced. So quite an interesting tool, and wondering also how it could actually be, go outside the space of trafficking and really reach other spaces across achieving some of the objectives. I think that the Global Compact for Migration and what we're sort of calling the interconnection between the different objectives, often often we are looking at these as silos. We come, in the webinars, we're breaking them down, but actually in reality, and even with your work, you can see the cross-section relations between them. My very last question then is kind of looking a bit forward. In terms of the dreams that you have, maybe we can, we can kickstart with some contributions coming from your side. Where do you see the potential to do better? Where do you see the potential to fill gaps? Where do you see the opportunities where there can be an effective use of ICT in fighting human trafficking?
So moving forward, if we think of global compact and moving forward, that's multi-stakeholders, multi-countries, and part of that is always from victim identification, because that's the part that I know, trying to figure out who the person is that a worker trusts, because they're not going to tell just anybody about this sensitive information. I was forced to have a pregnancy test, all of this stuff. So we have to identify who it is, who people trust, and see if they will want to use a technology like this and share this de-identified, because we don't take any personally identifiable information, but see how these partners can collaborate together across different countries and different sectors and different stakeholder groups to get a better understanding of different patterns. Because when we understand them, human trafficking and migration and all this, it's multiple parties involved. So we need to have those different perspectives, the different questions that we ask to get a better understanding of what's going on, because we can't fix what we don't know. Yeah.
Indeed, we can't fix what we don't know, and I think you're doing a very interesting work with Appraise, and we wish you all the best, and we're very happy that we were able to hear about this interesting work here as part of our webinar on eradicating trafficking. Thank you so much, Hannah, and have a good day.
Thank you very much. See ya.
That was an amazing interview. Paddy, you should have actually just moderated this as well. I don't know why you insisted on me doing it. And for all of you, Paddy has asked a question around what comes to mind when you think about the challenges to identification of potential victims of trafficking. So I'm opening up the floor for questions and answers from the group, and then we will move to our final question and closing of remarks. So if you have a question to ask, you can raise your hand or ask it in the chat. I'm going to start with a question by Joanne, where she says, can we categorize the trafficked persons as migrants? And what then are the impacts of trafficking to the source of the country, the destination, and to the person themselves? Jean-Pierre, I think maybe very quickly you can add something, and then Teresa, from your experience, you can add something small, and then Agneti, I don't know if I've pronounced your name properly. You can then ask your question after that. Jean-Pierre.
So the short answer is yes, trafficked persons can be considered as migrants, assuming that they are migrants, assuming that they are trafficked to a country other than where they are nationals of. I think one of the common misconceptions of trafficking is that you do need to have a transnational element. You don't for trafficking, as Timothy was mentioning earlier as well. But in reality, many trafficked persons are indeed in a different country and are therefore migrants. What are the impacts on countries of origin, transit, and destination? I think there are different obligations that apply to different countries performing different roles in the trafficking context. Obviously, if you are a country of origin, some of the more kind of plain obligations include things around prevention, early identification, prevention of vulnerability to trafficking. If you're a country of destination, it's about identifying trafficked persons. It's about providing protection to trafficked persons as migrants and as trafficked persons. It's about prosecuting traffickers if they are in the destination country, and it's about providing compensation to victims. I think the other question to think about as well is what about kind of, and again, Timothy mentioned this, the question of consent. And very often what I hear from police officers, for example, when I provide training on these issues, is that the person wanted to move illegally across borders. That is not trafficking, that is smuggling. Even if the person consented, even if the person consented to the actual exploitation, if you have one of the means that are in the definition of trafficking, it is still trafficking, and that consent is rendered irrelevant. And the reason it's rendered irrelevant is because there is duress, there is coercion, there is deception, there is fraud, there is abuse of a position of vulnerability. The other thing I would say about the link between trafficking and migration specifically is that migration status is used by some traffickers as a means of coercing an individual to remain in a situation of exploitation. Migration policy itself can, in some cases, increase the vulnerability to trafficking by, for example, making someone's residence in a particular country dependent on their employer. And therefore that person doesn't feel they can leave that employer and they cannot leave that exploitative situation. And traffickers sometimes will take advantage of that. I mean, the common story is about traffickers taking passports away, but when taking that passport is symbolic of all the other conditions that come with migration, right? It's about taking away the possibility of that person leaving. So I'll stop there because I think we're tight on time, but I'm happy to come back to these questions.
That is a very amazing look at what you're doing in terms of what you've answered. How it's an amazing way to look at it in terms of consent, and we'll come back to that in a bit. But Ekaterina, is there anything that you want to add onto that very quickly?
No, I think it was perfectly answered, and very, very important to understand this this answer on that and the terminology and how we name the potential
things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I want to know if I'm on. Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, very well. I want to give a narrative here, and maybe the narrative will do well to answer some of the questions that is being asked by Paddy. Permit me not to mention the country here, so just not to downplay on them. I went to a certain country and I met some 3 girls, and I asked them, do you know that when you cross this sea into where you are going, somebody is going to take away your passport from you, which means automatically they take away your rights. And they laugh at me. And the answer that they give me is that, what right do I have at the country of my bed? Is it a right to be enslaved by a fellow human being? And I was unable to give answer to that question. Somebody have decided to sacrifice his own right to cross over the sea just to get a greener pasture. Now, Katrina made a statement that they deported a lot of people from the Gulf country, and all along before they know, they see them back. Well, sometimes we give consent. People give consent, whether we call it smuggling, whether we call it trafficking, people give consent to it. They sometimes agree to it based on the circumstances that they see within their environment, based on what is happening around them. No job, no source of income, no source of strength, no love, above all, no love by the leaders, by the thought follower, by the policymakers, no love. They don't have the people in mind when they're formulating the policies. And at that point, you have people that will cross the sea without caring whatever will happen to them, whether good or bad. Now we were asking, what can we do? Then I go back to my former word, orientation. If we give orientation to the community people, if we give orientation to the people at the grassroots, telling them, look, it is good to move, but at the same time, it's not good to sacrifice who you are because of what you want to get. It makes a lot more sense. If we can give that orientation to the grassroots people, we have foot soldiers, what we can call foot soldiers, standing at the border of countries that lead to countries, standing at the sea borders, and we will do a lot. We will gain more. That is my submission. Thank you.
Actually, Aniti, I don't know if you're done speaking, but that's amazing. I think that's a very important thing. And I think one of the things that we've had a conversation with Katerina around, one of the things that we try to do with the journalists that we work with is how to localize these terms. What is trafficking in Duluo? What is trafficking in Kikuyu? What is trafficking in all these different languages? And so I think that is that is a very important thing. How do we localize this? I can see Tekang has a question, and then after that, I think we will go to Jean-Pierre to sort of add some clarity on the question. I see conversations in the chat around distinguishing between smuggling and trafficking. So Tekang, you have the microphone.
Yeah, thanks very much for the topic, and thanks very much for the speakers. I wanted to ask this question. A lot of report about human trafficking and smuggling is particularly focusing on Africans being smuggled or being trafficked to Europe, and probably now what's making headlines is in the Gulf states. Don't we have cases where some Africans or some others from different African countries have been smuggled, let's say, to the east of Africa, from the north to the south, from the south to the north to the east? Do we have cases like that? And equally from Latin American countries, do we have other cases like that? Because a lot of research is mostly from Africa to this side of the world and a lot more. So I don't know if we got a lot of research on that or what.
I will pose that question to Timothy, who's working on research on the continent. I know the answer is yes, but Timothy, take it away. I think answer Tekang's question.
Hello,
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you quite
well. My network was not getting him so clearly. Perhaps he could come again, please.
Sorry, Timothy, can you hear us?
Repeat the question.
Can he repeat the question? I can now hear you clearly.
If I can quickly sort of recap it.
Yes, sure.
Tekang's question was around the fact that most of the research and the reporting around trafficking is on stories of people being taken to Europe and to Western countries and the Gulf states as well, in different places. Are there cases of people being trafficked within Africa? And is there any research around that? And sort of, I think you might want to know where to find that.
Okay. Now that's clear. Like I mentioned previously, the TIP report 2019 from the US Department of State stated that 78% of trafficking happens internally in the countries. So actually, just about 30% is international trafficking. But the thing that brings confusion is because people, if you ask people what is human trafficking, they tell you transporting people. They think the issue is about transportation, when the issue is really about exploitation. So I think that's what brings the confusion. But if you go back to your country, let's go to the agricultural sector. Let me talk about my context in Kenya, for example. If you go to the agricultural sector, people are paid peanuts, I will tell you. If you go to and even children, child labor is experienced there because children work there. If you go to the lakeside and the coastal areas, you find that boys are used for fishing, for example, and they are paid peanuts. Young girls at the coast are used to entertain tourists, for example. So it's not always international, although it's happening now because of globalization. I would say there is there is the demand. You know, human trafficking is a business. So there's the demand and then there's the supply. So if you go, and Ekaterina can attest to this, if you go to Dubai, for example, majority of the workforce are foreigners. I can say this from this. Kenya has a long history with the Arab countries. I would say this, yes, because of our coastal region. Most of them are Muslims, and you know that Arabs came here, and that's how Swahili was actually born, the language, our national language. So you find that there is, it's in a nutshell, it's not just that it's about transportation or it's international. No, local is more than 70%. Yes. So maybe if Jean can add something. Yes. Thanks.
I mean, I completely agree. I think I think that's the reality of it, and unfortunately, I think we keep seeing states and service providers, and in some cases NGOs, trying to focus on the international dimension of trafficking, and not recognizing the domestic dimension, which is often, as you're mentioning, kind of the bigger numbers of cases. And I think that brings us back to this kind of distinction that Jessica Gerken asked about between trafficking and smuggling again. Yeah. And if I may, I think legally speaking, the two things are very different. As Timothy was saying, smuggling is about facilitating the crossing of an international border illegally, and then trafficking is about exploitation. Trafficking is about recruiting, hosting, keeping someone through deception, coercion, abuse of a position of vulnerability for the purpose of exploitation. So the two are quite separate. Obviously, you can have situations of smuggling that evolve into situations of trafficking, when people cannot afford to pay the smuggler, and instead the smuggler forces them into situations of exploitation because they abuse that position of vulnerability that the smuggled migrant finds themselves in. So it is a spectrum of it's a spectrum of vulnerability, it's a spectrum of exploitation, with trafficking on one side and smuggling on the other. There are issues which are further complicated. So I mentioned when I commented earlier on the question of consent, for example, legally speaking, in the context of trafficking, consent is always irrelevant. In the context of smuggling, the assumption is that there is consent. But when we talk about consent, even in the context of smuggling, we also need to bear in mind the fact that for many people, smuggling is the only option, right? It's the only option of fleeing persecution, fleeing conflict, etc., and arriving to a country to seek protection. And part of that is because there are no legal pathways to protection and no safe pathways to protection for many individuals. And I think that is also where we need to be thinking about, and I know we'll get to accountability eventually, but we need to be thinking about accountability both for the trafficker, the individual who is exploiting the individual, but also for the community, the policy makers, the state that is adopting policies that are heightening vulnerability to trafficking, and or not adopting policies that reduce vulnerability to trafficking. Yeah, I was thinking of something else, but now I forgot for a second. And I think there's questions, so I'll stop there.
All right, so I think I'm going to open it. Oh, sorry. So I think, Ngozi, if you can hold on for a few quick seconds, I think Ekaterina might actually have a point, a case study that might be able to highlight this a little bit better. And I know that we are supposed to end in the next 1 minute, but since we started late, please let me know if you're okay giving us an extra 10 minutes or so that we can wrap up this conversation and get to all your questions. So let us know yay or nay whether we have a bit of your time in the chat. Ekaterina.
Yes, I just wanted to share very quickly a case study just to put smuggling and human trafficking in context and how it actually can happens that somebody does not give consent to smuggling as well. So for example, we have two countries. To one country is easier to obtain a visa than the other, but there is work available in the other country. The worker, it is trafficked to, let's say, a particular country where it's easier to come in with the promise to work there. But actually, there are porous border places within the border where they are smuggled. So to put it into context, for example, UAE, it's easier to obtain a visa than in Oman. There is a lot of smuggling of domestic workers in the border of UAE and Oman, Kuwait, and Saudi. The women that are smuggled do not give consent to be smuggled, but because they have a family that needs a domestic worker, the traffickers smuggle her. Basically, they go through the border without their consent and put her to work in a house in another country. So, and then you have the exploitation part happening. Just so you know, she is smuggled. She is trafficked into the UAE with the promise of working in a restaurant. She is smuggled across the border without her consent, and then she's exploited as a domestic worker. And that is just more than one case study that we have seen.
Thank you so much for that clarification, Ekaterina. That's actually a very good point. Ngozi, I think you can ask your question now.
Yeah. Okay. So, some of the things we call trafficking, internal trafficking, or that is trafficking that does not go across the border, they have cultural aspects. Like in my own part of the world, we have what you call Ewa boy, which is apprenticeship, whereby a young person goes to stay with a master for 6, 8, sometimes 10 years, depending on the contract, which is not written. It's just verbally. Then stays with the person, and after serving on the process, the person will be learning the trade or the skill. After the time elapses, he will be set up with items to start his own trade. And also you have the airways. They have what you call tricosi, whereby women or young ladies are kept in with a priest, to serve a priest for a lifetime. Some of these things, they have cultural aspects. So tackling them, you have to also involve the locals. You have to involve the traditional heads of our societies. Also, I keep saying that human trafficking, smuggling, and irregular migration can only stop when North America and Europe stop dumping, because those they have foreign implications here. Nigeria paid $500 million to fight jets, and they have bandits. They are using arms and ammunition dumped here from countries, Europe, Africa. So you have to pay back this, when they now have to pay. The money that is supposed to be used for economic development are used to pay bandits and terrorists to channel arms. You see, and this money going into keep going abroad. It's like flight. They will be taken away from Africa. So in the era of involuntary immunity that we are now, the only way to reduce or stop smuggling and irregular migration is create legal pathways for people who have the ability to escape in Africa, because we are created by that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ngozi. I think that is something that we're going to be talking about very quickly because I think we are sort of running out of time. Joanne, Gloria, ask your question.
Thank you, moderator, Madam Naima. My question is, or rather, a view that I have is that, in accordance to what Timothy has explained to us, that trafficking is all about exploitation. Can we then liken it to the modern slavery? Because we experience people being taken, like for instance, from the rural areas and promised jobs at the urban areas, and then they get exploited in those areas. So then can we liken it to the modern slavery? And according to what Madam Paddy posted in the chat box, that about the gaps that we experience at the local level, could we say that all these smuggling and trafficking of persons is all brought about by the unemployment in our countries, maybe, or the underemployment, the overpopulation, and also the laxity of government to implement policies about the migrant workers, or to put in place the policies that protects these persons. Yeah, that is my question. Come insight. Thank you.
I think I'm going to let Jean-Pierre answer that because I think he has some amazing insight. He has shared an amazing resource in the chat. Jean-Pierre, take it away.
Thank you. Yes, we can consider trafficking as a form of modern slavery, is the short answer. I think the terminology of again, speaking purely as a lawyer, the terminology of modern slavery can be sometimes problematic, in the sense that legally speaking, modern slavery doesn't mean anything specific, but trafficking does. We have a legal definition in the context of trafficking. In modern slavery, we have quite old definitions of slavery, but not of modern slavery, and that is where it can sometimes become problematic. We see the wording of modern slavery being more and more used in certain contexts. In two main contexts. One is in the context of business and human rights and labor exploitation and supply chains, and the use of the terminology of modern slavery in that context. And then also kind of as a catch-all term covering both trafficking and that sort of labor exploitation. In the UK, we use modern slavery a lot, and I think part of that comes down to that is what we called our legislation in 2015. We called it the Modern Slavery Act. Part of that, I would argue, is to differentiate ourselves from what the US was doing, which was focusing on trafficking in persons and kind of leading the way in that context through the TIP reports, etc., that Timothy was talking about. And we wanted to kind of differentiate with that as well. But I think the two things are kind of can be used interchangeably, but we should be careful in how we do that because, again, words matter, and legally speaking, words matter quite a lot. The other thing to say is that slavery and conditions similar to slavery are also one of the manifestations of exploitation to which the trafficking definition refers. So it becomes kind of the circular thing where trafficking is slavery and slavery is a form of trafficking. So we also, again, need to disentangle some of those threads. And I think this comes back to the question of language that was mentioned earlier. And I thought about this when we were talking about the difference between trafficking and smuggling. So in Malta, which is where I'm originally from, we often have news reporting about this case of trafficking and this case of trafficking and this case of trafficking. And very often it is about smuggling. And it's very clearly a case of smuggling. But in the local language, in Maltese, we use the same word for smuggling as we do for trafficking, which means that court documents are using the same word because they're Maltese, which means that journalists will then translate it into trafficking rather than into smuggling as well. I also wanted to go back to Ekaterina's example before, and I think it highlighted something which in the kind of policy discussions around migration, we very often talk about mixed flows of migrants, and people on the same boat, literally speaking, very often when we're talking about the Central Mediterranean, for example, or well, the Mediterranean in general, having kind of different profiles, and some being trafficked, some being smuggled, etc. I think it's also important to add one further layer of complexity to that, which is that the same individual will very often have multiple profiles. So the same person can all at the same time be smuggled, trafficked, an asylum seeker, a refugee, etc., etc. The same individual having multiple profiles is part of how we need to understand this idea of mixed flows. And I think in policy discussions, very often we kind of assume that one person has one profile, and there might be different people with different profiles in the same boat, and we need to kind of distinguish between them. But actually, it comes down to the individual having multiple profiles, which then translates into the next question, which is, what protections does this person need, and what protections does this person receive? Because if he or she are assumed to be smuggled, for example, they might not receive the same forms of assistance that the trafficked person receives, or should receive, I should say. And in the same way, someone who might be trafficked and a refugee might be put into the trafficking referral mechanism, excluding them from the asylum process in some cases. Or if you apply for asylum, you're automatically taken out of the national referral mechanism. So I think keeping this idea of the same person having multiple profiles in mind is something quite important, and something that the policy framework could do better at, to put it diplomatically.
I'm still muted. Well, and since we are getting to the very end, we've taken quite a lot of your time, and I understand that you have been, as participants, you've been here for a very long time. We're very sorry. I hope this conversation has been worth the couple of minutes that we've taken from you. So we've talked a lot about consent and how that's used to differentiate between smuggling and between smuggling and trafficking. And as I ask you all for your final remarks, what would you want people to take away after this session from the conversation that we've had? Consent comes with accountability. Someone has to be accountable for negating the consent of a person, not getting that consent of a person, or lying to a person, which sort of negates consent. For all of you, what does accountability look like? And maybe one of you, maybe Jean-Pierre, you can answer the question around how, why is accountability important? And I think I will start this with Ekaterina, and then I will go to Jean-Pierre, and then I will ask Timothy to close us out. So let's do this as quickly as we possibly can. Ekaterina.
I will be as brief as possible. And I think I will go back to your initial question, Naima. How far are we from since the adoption of the Global Compact on Migration, and talking now about accountability, and that's an indicator, how far are we? It is being stated by the State Department that only 0.2% of all modern day slavery cases reach a court. 0.2%, and we're talking about one of the most lucrative businesses in the world. Is it important? I believe it's a key indicator of how far we are in eradicating human trafficking. And accountability, it is usually in the context of human trafficking, it is more than one person, it is more than one entity. And I think, just as a final remarks, is for everyone to think the area of human trafficking is very complex, in the sense that it doesn't happen with just a group of individuals. we believe that we are all part of it. We need to be accountable, starting by ourselves. How? Where do we buy our clothes from? Is it a business that is accountable? Is it a business that is transparent? Is it doing its best to eradicate human trafficking in its supply chain? It starts by us, the consumers. Second level of accountability is the businesses themselves, the recruitment agencies, for example, or any kind of business. Are they doing what they're supposed to do? Are they accountable for doing their job, to making sure that there is no human trafficking within their supply chains? And states, are they protecting individuals? Are they preventing? And are they holding accountable those that need to be held accountable? Thank you, Naima.
Thank you so much, Ekaterina. Jean-Pierre.
I think Ekaterina covered a lot of what I wanted to say. I think accountability is important because people who are doing something wrong or not doing what they ought to be doing should be held accountable. And I'll talk primarily about legal accountability, but that is not the only type of accountability out there. And I think there's a lot of forms of accountability that as buyers, as clients, as consumers, we can bring to business and we can bring to the world of work that has significantly, in some cases, more impact than the legal frameworks. But I'll talk about the legal frameworks because, again, I'm a lawyer. So the first level of accountability, I think, needs to be on traffickers, making sure that traffickers are held accountable. That requires identification of trafficked persons, and through them, or through that, the identification of the traffickers. The second layer of accountability is on service providers to make sure that the services they are providing are meeting the standards that they ought to meet. And that we don't assume, for example, that because we're doing something with good intentions, it's automatically good enough for trafficked persons. And I think that is something important to keep in mind. The next level of accountability, I think, comes down to communities. And that's where consumer behavior type issues come in as well, but also making sure that communities everywhere are not promoting trafficking or allowing trafficking by not disclosing situations of exploitation, by not reacting to situations of exploitation, and again, as Timothy said earlier, both looking at the demand side and the supply side of things. The next level of accountability, to my mind, is even more important, which is holding states to account. Holding states to account for what they should be doing and that they're not doing, and holding states to account when their failures mean that individuals end up being in situations of exploitation or being vulnerable to situations of exploitation and trafficking. We've seen some of this. We've seen that in the European Court of Human Rights. We've seen that in the Inter-American Court, for example. And so we've seen some attempts to hold states to account. We need to see more of that. There's been a recent case filed, I think, just last week against 2 countries in front of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, also trying to hold countries to account for trafficking, etc. But when states, it's not only about states kind of allowing or even facilitating, in some cases, trafficking and exploitation. It's about looking at state policy and how that state policy is impacting smuggling, is impacting human trafficking and vulnerability to trafficking. Whether that's conditional residence permits, whether that's conditional visas more generally, whether that's the denial of legal pathways to protection, whether that's policies that are excluding some people from the societal safety net. And then finally, it's accountability for the international community that has obligations of cooperation to deal with trafficking. But when the international community and when states through the international community are using trafficking not are using trafficking as a pretext to undertake things that are themselves in violation of other human rights, such as the right to leave, for example, or such as the right to seek asylum, when the use of trafficking as an excuse to deal with, to further close borders, etc. And I know I'm complicating the things between trafficking and smuggling, but very often trafficking is used as the excuse for further closing borders and making it harder, etc., etc. And I think that is where, again, the international community needs to come in. I think Hannah in her video talked about technology neither being good nor bad. It's about how you use it. And I would say, and I think some people on this call have heard me say this last Saturday, I think cooperation is exactly the same way. Cooperation itself is neither good nor bad. It is about how we use it. And I think that would be my key takeaway from today's session. I think.
Thank you so much, Timothy. Very quickly, I think we've taken a lot of people's times very, very quickly. Accountability, or that's the one thing that you want people to take away?
Thank you very much. The problem with having Ekaterina and Jean speaking fast is they say everything. And I'm left, and I'm literally left with nothing to say, but I'll just add something. For me, I think governments are key, the states, which has been mentioned already, because they are the duty bearer. And the citizens are the duty holder, for example. So you find that governments do not have social protection systems for their citizens. They're leaving them at the whims of traffickers. And like Jean has pointed out, traffickers are the first people who should be held accountable, because I think they're the major cause of human trafficking, other than poverty and every other thing, because they're the people who take advantage of the position of vulnerability. Because again, you find that governments are not prompt to ensure that things like minimum wage are really looked into. You find that government officials are also complicit in this crime. You find that quite a number of them own even these employment agencies. Governments are not prompt to give funds to fight human trafficking. There are no shelters. There are very few shelters, for example, that are government-driven. In very many countries, maybe in the first world, it's different. But here, it's the civil society organizations that struggle with that on their own. Some because now, like my country is tier 2, and tier 2 here means that they are not up to the minimum standard for the elimination of trafficking, but they're really doing quite a lot towards that. But I can't say it's quite a lot, because it's where we are still Ugandans are coming. A lot of Ugandans are coming into this country. A lot of Ethiopians. There are civil wars and Somalia, for example. Another thing, I think the society, which has already been mentioned, we demand the drive. We drive the demand, I mean, because we are the people who buy sex, for example. We're the people who buy things that in the supply chains, they're elements of human trafficking. And so I think it's because of our behaviors and habits that we've also really contributed. And one other thing that I think is very huge about the society is, Jean has also mentioned this, is turning a blind eye, or really trying not to do anything about it while it's happening. So I think it's something that we can do. And I think CSOs can have a lot of work to do in terms of advocacy, in terms of identifying the cases. And I think you would agree with me that data has been a challenge in the fight against human trafficking. And because you find different entities saying labor trafficking is the most prevalent, others say sex trafficking is the most prevalent. So I think we also need to step up our game, and in terms of really Because if we have data, then we're moving from a point of known to unknown. And I think that we will really be in a good highway towards eradicating human trafficking. Thank you.
So I first and foremost want to say thank you very much for this amazing conversation. Paddy, I think this issue needed more than one session. There's so much that we wanted to go into and we didn't, but I want to say thank you so much to all the participants. Thank you for your amazing contributions. Thank you for being here and staying with us this long. For my panelists, for Hannah, who's not here, Ekaterina, Jean-Pierre, and Timothy, thank you so much. What I've taken away from this is that we need to have a lot more collaboration and we need to have a lot more understanding around human trafficking, and that accountability may be where we need to start, because if we... I think you need to mute yourself. And so I think that's what I've taken away from this. You've raised a lot of amazing questions. I hope we are able to continue these conversations. And I think all of you will join me in saying thank you to Paddy and all the organizers for making this happen, for allowing us to share ideas. And I hope that you all have an amazing end of the year, and that we keep dreaming about the difficult dream. Can we dream of a world without human trafficking? Paddy, over to you.
Naima, Ekaterina, Jean-Pierre, and Timothy, and also Hannah in absentia, just to say thank you so much for having joined us today. And also thank you, to all the, saying just a big thanks to all our participants who were here today. That chat was alive with a lot of questions, with a lot of engagement, with a lot of feedback also. And that's what we always like in this space, that we're really sharing from your local space onto this very global platform, but with a lot of local intel in terms of supporting initiatives and in terms of supporting efforts that go into the different pieces, discussions, technical dialogue, as well as the various inputs that our participants will take away as part of this course on this particular objective. It's been enlightening. I cannot summarize. I think you have done well, Naima, in just putting everything together, and all the participants in highlighting a lot of things. Some things definitely need to stand out in terms of some of the interlinkages we have seen between the Global Compact for Migration objectives. One wonders as we leave this room, and maybe it's a question, how do we kick traffickers out of business? And there we talk about regular pathways, and there we talk about regularization, because we're talking about a problem as though we don't have the solutions. So I wonder, even as we go away, can global partners, local partners, can we use everything that we have in our might to get to see a world that we want? And that starts by everything that we have to do. A very interesting challenge that you've given to us, Katerina, from everything that we do in our everyday life, and how that impacts on the global space. So thanks a lot to everyone for joining us. And that will end our webinar for today. Just one small announcement for the students. We have a change of program on Saturday, and we will talk about it in the classroom. So I will not say happy holidays yet, because we are yet to dive into some other interesting issues. This week, as everybody would know who works in migration governance, is International Migrants Day is coming up on the 18th. And the question has been raised, are we celebrating, or what are we doing? So we're going to try and explore and pack around this International Migrants Day and what that means in the context, and really using some of the issues that we have been discussing, not just here in this webinar today, but also in other parts in the migration space. So we're looking forward to seeing you next Saturday. And there is no GCM webinar next week, because we're going to take a break for the holidays, but we're coming prompt back in January. We don't waste the time for us to finish. But for our panelists today, once again, Ekaterina, Jean-Pierre, Timothy, and the ever excellent Naima, thank you so much, and have a pleasant evening. Asia, I think we have denied you of sleep. Africa is going into the evening. Europe is also going into the evening. And so it's good morning to the Americas. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye, everyone.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.